The morning Lady Constance Ashby arrived at Thornwell Hall to catalogue the late Earl's library. She did not expect to find the new Earl of Thornwell seated at his own writing table, watching her with the particular expression of a man who has discovered something faintly beneath him. She had not been told he was in residence. She had been told, by the solicitor in Bath, that the Earl was in London. She had been told the hall would be quiet, the housekeeper courteous, and the work uncomplicated. She had carried these assurances on the 3-day coach journey like a folded letter she did not dare open, and now they scattered on the floor of the library like a handful of pins. The man at the writing table did not rise. He looked at her the way men look at furniture they are deciding whether to sell. His name was Julian Ashford, Earl of Thornwell, 31 years old, and recently returned from 2 years abroad, and the room seemed arranged around him as though it had been waiting for this particular occupation. He was broad through the shoulder, his dark coat fitted with a precision that suggested a London tailor rather than country habits, his jaw set in the manner of a man who had grown accustomed to rooms adjusting themselves to his presence. His hair was the color of ink in candlelight, cut short and dressed without ornament. His eyes were a gray so pale they seemed to carry their own light, and they moved over her with a deliberation that catalogued her as precisely as she intended to catalogue his books. She had been standing in the doorway for perhaps 15 seconds. He had not yet spoken. She said, "I believe I have the wrong room." She did not believe this at all. "You have the right room," he said. His voice was level, carrying no particular inflection. "You are the woman my solicitor hired to sort my father's books." "Miss Vane," she said. "Harriet Vane. Your solicitor engaged me to assess and catalogue the collection." "Yes." He looked at the stack of leather-bound volumes beside her basket as though they had arrived under dubious circumstances. "My solicitor," he said, "does not, apparently, employ men for work of this nature." There it was. She had heard variations of this observation her entire professional life, and she had developed a practiced stillness in response to it. The stillness of a woman who has learned that her reply matters less than her composure. She set her basket down on the nearest table. She drew off her gloves, one finger at a time. She said, "I am quite thorough, my lord." His mouth moved. She could not have said whether it was a smile. "I have no doubt," he said. He returned to his letter. She was dismissed. The village of Thornwell-upon-Avon had already formed its opinion of her. She had been in its vicinity for 4 days, lodging at the inn kept by a widow named Mrs. Fitch, and in 4 days the village had established her situation with the thoroughness of a community that has few other subjects. She was unmarried, which explained itself. She was a bookseller's daughter from Bristol, which explained her occupation. She was 27 years old, which placed her firmly and finally on the wrong side of any reasonable marital expectation. She had come to catalogue the late Earl's library, which was, in the opinion of 3 separate women at the village pump, a task better suited to a clergyman. "She is just the spinster from Bristol," Mrs. Dorothea Crane had announced at the assembly rooms the preceding Thursday, with the kind of confidence that comes from having invented the description oneself. "She will catalogue the books and go, and that will be that." Harriet had been standing near enough to hear it clearly. She had returned to her room at the inn and eaten her supper with a book propped against the salt cellar, and if the candle had blurred somewhat before she finished her soup, she attributed it to the quality of the tallow. The library itself, when she came to know it properly, was a revelation. The late Earl had collected with genuine intelligence, the kind of intelligence that accumulates across a lifetime of reading rather than a season of fashionable acquisition. There were 400 years of natural philosophy, 2 shelves of Elizabethan drama in editions she had handled only once before, and an entire cabinet of correspondence between the second Earl and a botanist in Edinburgh that should properly have been preserved in a county archive. The collection wanted not merely a catalogue, but a scholar. She had been hired as the former and would quietly become the latter, and she began to understand why the solicitor had sought someone who could read Latin. She worked 6 hours the first full day, 7 the second. The Earl did not return to the library. On the third morning he did. She was on the upper gallery when she heard the door, climbing the narrow iron stair to reach a shelf that had been poorly labeled in what appeared to be the fourth Earl's hand, and she looked down to find him standing at the entrance to the room with a letter in his hand and a frown on his face that suggested he had found her presence less expected than it ought to have been. "You are still here," he said. "The collection is extensive," she said. He moved into the room as though reasserting ownership of it, which she supposed it was. He set his letter on the writing table. He looked at the organized stacks she had made, the numbered cards, the preliminary pages of the catalogue with its system of cross-references. He picked up one of her cards and read it. "You have noted the provenance," he said, "where I could determine it." He set the card down with a careful deliberateness that she read, instinctively, as respect. He said nothing further. He sat in the chair by the window and opened his own correspondence, and they worked in silence for 2 hours. And when she came down from the gallery to sharpen her pencil at the table, she was aware of exactly where he was in the room without looking. The awareness annoyed her. She had not come here to be aware. On the fourth morning, before she arrived, she heard what Mrs. Fitch relayed over breakfast, with the practiced innocence of a woman who is not attempting to wound. Lord Thornwell had been at supper at the Cranes the previous evening. There had been discussion of the library project. He had apparently remarked, in the hearing of Mrs. Crane's daughter Philippa, that he found it faintly absurd that his solicitor had engaged a spinster to do a scholar's work, since spinsters, in his experience, were more reliable at sorting ribbons than folios. Mrs. Fitch had relayed this with elaborate care, as though she were merely reporting weather. Harriet finished her porridge. She thanked Mrs. Fitch. She walked the quarter-mile to the hall in the sharp morning air, and she sat down at the library table, and she opened her catalogue, and she wrote 6 pages before the feeling in her chest had settled into something she could ignore. She did not cry. She had not cried in front of anyone since her father's funeral. And she had not cried at her father's funeral because there had been too much to manage. The creditors first, and then the shop inventory, and then the question of where she would live, and grief had taken the form, in her experience, of work rather than water. She returned to the library, and she opened the natural philosophy section, and she worked without pausing until the light changed, and her back ached from the low shelf. And she thought about the phrase with its particular rhythm, "Spinster from Bristol," and she thought that it had the quality of a description that had been waiting to be used, the way a key waits for a lock. And she understood that Lord Thornwell had not invented the opinion. He had merely confirmed that he had heard it, and found it useful. She was aware, somewhere beneath the competent surface of her work, that she had expected better from the library. She always expected something slightly better from libraries. Her father had kept a bookshop in which everyone, regardless of their address, had been permitted to read. It had not made him wealthy. It had made him a man she still missed, with a directness that occasionally surprised her. The Crane household's influence over the district was neither subtle nor brief. Dorothea Crane had been the social authority of Thornwell upon Avon for 18 years, since the death of the old countess, and she had managed this authority with the careful application of small public verdicts that accumulated, over time, into a kind of local gospel. She had a daughter of 23, Philippa, who was charming in the uncomplicated way of very pretty women who have never been asked to manage anything difficult. Philippa had been positioned, with considerable maternal industry, as the natural future Countess of Thornwell. The Earl's return from abroad had been treated by Dorothea as something close to a stage direction she had written herself. Harriet observed all of this from the particular vantage of the library, which was a better post than any drawing room for observing the machinery of a house. The housekeeper, Mrs. Locke, spoke more freely in the library than she would have anywhere else, and Mrs. Locke had a clear eye and a soft voice, and she had let fall, over 3 separate mornings, the information that Lord Thornwell had taken no pleasure in his reception at the Cranes, that Philippa bored him with a thoroughness that he concealed with increasing effort, and that Dorothea had begun to speak of a dinner she intended to host at the Hall. "She considers it already hers," Mrs. Locke said, dusting a shelf with a concentration that suggested she was not thinking about the shelf at all. Harriet noted a folio edition she had been looking for. She said carefully, "He is the Earl. Surely the decision is his." "Men who have recently buried their fathers," Mrs. Locke said, "are not always certain what decisions are theirs to make." The dinner was arranged for a Saturday. Harriet was not invited. She had not expected to be. She came to the library on Saturday morning, as she came every morning, and she worked. And at noon, Mrs. Locke brought her tea without being asked, and the small kindness of it was a thing she tucked away like a pressed flower, useful later in some private accounting she did not share with anyone. Lord Thornwell came to the library at 2 in the afternoon, when she had been certain he would not. She had her back to the door. She was on her knees at the bottom shelf, attempting to read a title that had been stamped in an ink that had not survived the century. And she heard him stop in the doorway. And she said, without turning, "The Locke correspondence is in order, if you wish to see it." A pause. "I did not come for the Locke correspondence," he said. She turned. He was in the doorway with his arms crossed, watching her in a way that was different from the way he had watched her before. She rose from her knees in a movement she tried to make dignified. She was not certain she achieved it. He moved into the room. "I have been told," he said, "that you can read Latin." "Adequately," she said. "My father's correspondence with the 3rd Earl of Hadley is in Latin. I have not been able to determine whether it is significant or merely vain." She considered this. "I could look at it," she said. He went to the cabinet in the corner, the locked one she had noted on the first day and not presumed to ask about, and he produced a key from his coat pocket and opened it and brought out a small stack of letters tied with brown cord. He set them on the table beside her catalogue. He stood at the table with his hands in his pockets and waited. She untied the cord. She read the first letter through. She read the second. She said, "These are letters about a property dispute. Your great-grandfather believed he had been defrauded of 30 acres in the Hadley settlement of 1788. He documents the argument across, I would estimate, 8 or 9 letters. Lord Thornwell was very still. Does he prove the fraud? He said. He proves the case, she said. Whether he pursued it is a different question. There was a silence in the library that felt like snow, the particular quiet of something about to settle. He said, "Miss Vane." She looked up. He was not looking at the letters. He was looking at her with an attention she did not know how to receive, because it was not the assessing attention of the first morning, and not the dismissive attention she had heard reported from the Crane's supper table. It was something more careful than either. It was the attention of a man who has revised a position and is not yet certain how to account for the revision. He said, I owe you an apology." She was not certain, for a moment, that she had heard correctly. She set the letter down. "I made remarks," he said, "at the Crane's supper that were reported to you. I cannot be certain by whom. I have reason to believe they caused you distress." She said nothing. Her hands were very still on the table. This was not the conversation she had expected. He said, "They were said in the spirit of social deflection, and they were unkind. They were also wrong. I have seen your catalogue. I have watched you work. What you are doing in this room is not what I said it was. And you deserved better than to hear it secondhand." She looked at the middle distance, somewhere past his shoulder, at the rows of books she had touched and sorted and placed in order. She said, "You said it in company, my lord. It cost you very little." "Yes," he said. "I know." She looked at him then, directly, in the manner she generally permitted herself only when she was certain no one was watching. He did not look away. He had a small scar above his left brow, pale against his skin, that she had not noticed before. His hands, at his sides, were not quite still. She had the sudden, inconvenient impression that his apology had cost him something, though she could not have said what precisely. She said, "Very well." It was not forgiveness. It was the door left open. He seemed to understand the distinction. He nodded once, a movement more precise than a bow, and he took the Latin letters from the table and returned them to the cabinet and locked it. And he left the library. And she stood at the table for a moment in the silence he had left behind, and she understood that something had shifted in the room's arrangement that she was not prepared for. If you have ever waited to see what a man does after he has acknowledged his error, you will understand why she said nothing further to Mrs. Locke, nothing to Mrs. Fitch, and nothing to the brief and curious letters her friend Margaret sent from Bath. You watch and you wait, and you do not permit yourself to construct an expectation from a single apology, because a single apology costs very little, and means, in isolation, precisely nothing. She watched. She had a method for watching. It was the same method she applied to a shelf of books in an unfamiliar collection, the method her father had taught her, which was that you do not decide what something is before you have read it. You wait until it tells you. A book that announces its virtue on the first page is often a disappointment. A book that opens quietly, without preface, and then builds and builds and builds, is the kind you carry for years. She was aware this was an unusual way to think about a man. She noted that he was not what she had expected him to be on the first morning. The man who had not risen when she came in, who had dismissed her with the same economy he would have applied to a parcel improperly addressed, was not the man who had brought Latin letters to the table and waited with real patience while she read them. People were sometimes different people than their first impression suggested, and she knew this. And she applied to it the same discipline she applied to everything, which was that she would not draw a conclusion from insufficient evidence. He came to the library the following morning without stated purpose. He sat at the window with a journal, and she catalogued the Elizabethan drama, and the silence between them was of a different quality than the first silence had been. This silence was not the silence of two strangers ignoring each other. It was the silence of two people who have each become aware of the other's breathing. At 11, he said, without looking up from his journal, "The third shelf from the window on the north wall. My father put 3 volumes there that he did not want found. I have been wondering since I returned whether you had noticed them." She had. She had noticed them on the first day and said nothing, because they were not her business. They were 3 thin journals bound in gray cloth, pressed between 2 larger volumes as though they had been hidden in a hurry by a man in insufficient hurry. She said, "I noted them. I left them." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "They are my mother's." She did not move from the shelf where she stood. She said very carefully, "I will leave them out of the catalog." He said, "No." Another pause. "She died when I was 11. He never spoke of her afterward. I have not been able to bring myself to read them." This was more than he had said to her in total across the preceding days. She understood, from the careful flatness of his voice, what it had cost him. She said nothing. She returned to the shelf in front of her, and she did not look at the north wall, and she understood that the gray journals were the anchor of something she had not yet been shown. She catalogued 4 more volumes before he spoke again. "I came back from the continent with the intention," he said, "of discharging my obligations and returning. The estate, the season, the expected announcement, all of it arranged before I arrived. I found I had very little interest in arrangements." She said, "Is that what I am? An arrangement?" It was the sharpest thing she had said to him. She had not entirely planned it. He turned in the chair and looked at her directly. He said, "No. You are the first honest thing in this house since I came home." She gripped the spine of the volume she was holding and said nothing, because there was nothing she trusted herself to say. The dinner at the hall was arranged by Dorothea with the skill of a woman who had been drafting guest lists in her head for a decade. It was set for the following Friday, 20 guests, and Harriet heard about it from Mrs. Locke, who reported it with the careful neutrality of a woman who is not expressing an opinion she has. The dinner was to include a musical evening. Philippa played the pianoforte with considerable facility. The placement at table was arranged so that Lord Thornwell would sit at the right hand of his hostess, which was to say, at the right hand of a woman who had appropriated his house for an evening. And Dorothea had secured this by the simple strategy of arriving 3 days early and speaking to the housekeeper in the tone of a woman who considered herself the mistress of the establishment already. Harriet heard this from Mrs. Locke. She said, "And he permitted it?" Mrs. Locke said, "His lordship was in the Northfield," and said nothing further. She was at work on Friday morning when he came in at 9 o'clock, earlier than usual, and he stood at the window for a moment without sitting down. And she said, because the set of his shoulders was that of a man who is about to say something he does not want to say, "You need not make conversation on my account." He turned. He said, "I need your opinion." She was surprised enough to set her pencil down. He said, "About the Crane family." She considered this. She said carefully, "It is not my place to offer an opinion about your guests." "I am not asking your opinion of my guests," he said. "I am asking your opinion of a decision I have been expected to make by a great number of people for a great number of months. And I find that the people who have opinions are precisely the people with the most to gain from a particular outcome." She looked at him steadily. She said, "Then you should make it alone." He said, "I have been alone for 2 years. I find I have had enough of my own counsel." This was said without inflection, in the same level voice he had used since the first morning, but it landed differently than anything else he had said. She felt it land somewhere she had been careful to keep empty. She said, "Miss Crane is pleasant." "She is," he said. "She would manage the estate competently." "She would," he said. "She would also be miserable in 3 years, and so would I, and we would be too well bred to say so." A silence. She said, "Then say so." He looked at her for a long moment. He said very quietly, "Miss Vane, are you telling me that honesty is available in Thornwell upon Avon if one knows where to look for it?" She was not going to smile. She was absolutely not going to smile. She said, "I believe it has always been available in the library." The dinner proceeded without her. She heard it, faintly. From her room at the inn, the distant sound of carriages and then music, and then, much later, the sound of carriages departing in the direction of the Crane estate, which was 3 miles south, and she sat by the window until the sounds had gone because it felt dishonest to pretend she could not hear them. The inn looked out at the village green and the church beyond it, and the moon was up, and the whole of the night had the appearance of something arranged deliberately to emphasize her position in it, which was outside. She sat with the volume of natural philosophy she had borrowed against her rule to borrow nothing from the library, and she read it by candlelight, and she told herself, firmly and repeatedly, that the conversation in the library had been a conversation between an earl and an employee, and that employees with 27 years of experience at being overlooked should know better than to reorder their interior landscape on the basis of a man looking at them honestly once. She told herself this until the candle was low. She told herself this while she ate the cold supper Mrs. Fitch had left covered on the tray. She had been telling herself careful, instructive things for 27 years, and she was, she thought, very accomplished at it. And the problem with being accomplished at something is that you know precisely when you are failing. The candle burned down. She read 2 more chapters. She went to bed. She was back in the library by 8:30 the following morning because the Elizabethan drama had 4 more volumes, and she had promised herself she would finish them before the week's end. She found one of the gray cloth journals on the writing table. It was open. She stood in the doorway looking at it for a moment without entering. Then she came in. She set her basket down. She looked at the page it was open to without reading it, because it was not hers to read. And then she saw his handwriting at the margin. A single line. She looked at it because it was in his hand, and therefore was not a private grief but a deliberate leaving. It said, in his narrow, precise script, 4 words she read, and then read again. She catalogued everything by its worth, not its station. She stood very still. She understood, then, what the journal was. It was his mother's. The entry it was open to described the library, the morning light, the way she had loved it, the particular quality of the east window in the early hours when the household was not yet moving, and the room was entirely hers. The late Countess had written in a small, careful hand, the hand of a woman accustomed to writing for herself rather than for others, and the entry was 5 lines about light and books and the particular smell of old paper on a cold morning, and it was the most private thing Harriet had ever been shown. The margin note was not an observation about his mother. She set her gloves on the table. She sat down. She put her hands flat on the surface of the table, because there was a quality of stillness she needed to achieve, and she had learned that her hands helped her find it. She looked at his handwriting. She catalogued everything by its worth, not its station. He had written it with the same pen he used for his correspondence, the narrow, deliberate hand, and he had pressed slightly harder than usual, which she recognized, from her own practice, as the mark of a sentence one is certain of. She thought about the first morning, the man who had not risen, the level eyes cataloguing her as furniture. She thought about the Latin letters set on the table without ceremony. She thought about the cup of tea at the foot of the gallery stair, precisely as she took it. She breathed in. She breathed out. She picked up her pencil. When he came in at 10, she was cataloguing the north wall's upper shelves. He said, from the door, "I saw you had found it." She said, without turning, "I did not read it." "I left it for you," he said. She came down from the step-stool. She turned. He was across the room, near the cabinet, and the morning light came through the high window above him and caught the pale scar above his brow. He looked like a man who had slept badly and was not particularly concerned with concealing it. she said. The evening was not what you hoped. The evening was exactly what I expected, he said, which is perhaps the same answer. A pause. Dorothea informed me at dinner that she had made arrangements regarding the spring announcement, and that she was certain I would agree when I had thought about it sensibly. Harriet said nothing. The anger she felt on his behalf surprised her with its heat. He said, I told her that I would not be making the expected announcement. She said carefully, How did she receive it? He said, With the conviction of a woman who has never been told no by a room that didn't later apologize. He looked at her. She also told me, in the course of the same conversation, that the spinster she had hired to sort the books was clearly developing notions above her station, and that I ought to be more careful about the company I kept in a library. The dismissive label again, third and final, uttered in the voice of a woman whose confidence was beginning, at last, to meet its limit. Harriet said, She said spinster. She did, he said. I told her, Miss Vane, that she had the facts of the situation materially wrong. She said, Which facts? He crossed the room. He did not rush. He moved with the deliberateness of a man who has made a decision and is committed to it from the first step, and he stopped at a distance from her that was close enough to be unambiguous, and far enough to be still a question. He said, She is not a spinster. She is the woman I intend to ask if she will consider a man who called her inadequate in company and has spent 3 weeks understanding how entirely he was wrong. She said, That is a great many words for a question. He said, Harriet. Her name. Said carefully, the 2 syllables placed with the weight of a man who has held them in his mouth for some time and is releasing them with full knowledge of what the act means. She said very quietly, You have not asked the question. He said, Will you let me try? She looked at him, at the careful set of his jaw and the pale scar and the gray eyes that had stopped cataloging her, and started, somewhere in the middle of the preceding 3 weeks, simply looking at her as though she were the thing worth seeing in the room. Her hands were at her sides. Her heart was audible, she was quite certain, to anyone in the vicinity. She said, I will let you try. He reached out slowly and took her hand. Not by the wrist, not commanding, but with the open palm of a man asking to hold something he knows he does not deserve to have given. His thumb traced the edge of her knuckle. The contact was so careful and so complete that she understood without further declaration that he was not offering an arrangement. She looked up at his face. He was not trying to conceal anything. This was the expression of a man without a mask, which was an expression she had never seen on him before. And it was, she thought, the most valuable thing in the room. And she had the whole library as a reference. She said, You will need to speak to me very directly, my lord. He said, Julian. She said his name once, quietly, like a key turned in a lock that has been waiting. The question, when he asked it, took 11 words. She answered in 2. They were standing in the east light of the library window, in the room that had been the most honest thing in Thornwell Hall for 300 years, and the dust of old paper was visible in the light between them, and his hand was warm around hers, and she did not look away. The news reached Mrs. Crane at the assembly rooms the following Tuesday. Mrs. Fitch had told Mrs. Pruitt, who had told the butcher's wife, and the butcher's wife had told Mrs. Crane's kitchen girl, and the kitchen girl had told Philippa's lady's maid, and by the time it reached Dorothea herself, it had acquired the full particulars. The Earl of Thornwell had proposed to the woman cataloguing his library. The spinster from Bristol, the bookseller's daughter. Dorothea sat with this intelligence for a moment. She said carefully, to no one in particular, I cannot imagine what he is thinking. She was not, however, asked. Harriet heard about this through Mrs. Locke, who reported it with the same careful neutrality she brought to all intelligence, though her mouth had a particular quality at the corners that Harriet was beginning to recognize. "And what did she say then?" Harriet asked. Mrs. Locke said, "She said very little after that, which is, in my experience, what a woman says when she has nothing left to say." Harriet went back to the catalog. She had 3 shelves remaining and a system of cross-references that would take another 4 days to complete, and she had promised, because she kept her promises, that the catalog would be finished before she left for Bath to collect her things. There was a great deal to organize, and the solicitor required correspondence, and the gray cloth journals required a decision, and the property letters in Latin required a reply to the Earl of Hadley, and all of it wanted ordering, and she was, above all other qualifications, thorough. She was on the upper gallery when he came in at 2, carrying a cup of tea, which he set on the small table beside the gallery stair. He did not call up to her. He simply left it there and went to the window, and she descended the stair and picked it up, and she said, "You are becoming domestic." He said from the window without turning, "I am practicing." She looked at the tea, which was exactly as she took it, which meant he had been attending. She said, "You noticed how I take it." He turned. He said, "I noticed quite a great deal." She sat down at the table and took her tea and looked at the shelves still to be done, and she thought about the gray journals and the Latin letters and the 30 acres in the Hadley settlement and the specific quality of the east light in the mornings, and she thought about her father's shop in Bristol and the smell of old paper and the long shelves of books that had been the map of her entire childhood, and she understood that she had spent 27 years cataloging the world without being cataloged herself, and that the man at the window had accomplished in 3 weeks what no one else had managed in all the years before. She said, "The catalog will be finished by Friday." He said, "Good." A pause. "I was thinking I might commission a second catalog." She said, "Of what?" He said, "The correspondence. It will take another month at least, given the Latin." She looked at him. He was looking out the window at the avenue of lime trees that lined the long drive, and his profile against the gray afternoon was the profile she had been looking at for 3 weeks without permitting herself to look. She said, "You are not a very subtle man, Julian." He said, "No, I find I am done with subtlety." She finished her tea. She put the cup down. She went back to the upper gallery, and she catalogued 3 more shelves, and below her she heard the quiet scratch of his pen at the writing table, and the afternoon light shifted, and the library held them both in its particular stillness, and the dust of old paper settled in the warm air between them, and for the first time in a very long while, the silence in the room was not the silence of a woman being overlooked. It was the silence of a woman at home. Spring came to Thornwell upon Avon, as it always did. Snowdrops first, then crocuses along the south wall, then the lime trees along the drive, putting out their first faint green. Mrs. Locke cut 3 branches of forced lilac for the library on the morning of the wedding, because the library was where it had all begun, and she was a woman with a strong sense of occasion. It was a quiet ceremony. The vicar of St. Clement's, who had known the late Earl, performed it with the quiet satisfaction of a man marrying 2 people he could see were suited. Julian's cousin Frederick stood up with him, a genial man who had liked Harriet immediately and with considerable sincerity. Mrs. Fitch came, and the solicitor from Bath who had written the letters, and Mrs. Locke, and the underkeeper's wife, and a cluster of villagers who had arranged themselves along the churchyard wall with the particular interest of people reconsidering an earlier verdict. Mrs. Crane was not present. She had sent a card. Harriet wore a cream gown, empire-waisted, with a Norwich shawl she had owned for 4 years, and a pair of gloves that fit. She carried nothing but her own hands, until Julian reached out and took one of them, in the same manner he had taken it in the library, the open palm, the patient waiting, and she looked up at his face, which was wearing its new expression, the one she had come to know across the spring months, the one that had replaced the mask and did not look like going back. When the vicar said the words that made it irrevocable, Julian said his answer in the steady voice he brought to things that mattered. Harriet said hers. The churchyard was bright with March sun, the gray stone walls holding the light in the way of old stone, and the lime trees along the avenue had their first leaves. Somewhere in the hall, in the library, on the table in the east light, the catalog sat in its completed form, with its system of cross-references, every volume in its proper order, everything named by its worth. And the 3 gray cloth journals were in the cabinet in the corner, which Julian had opened twice now, and which Harriet had held him through on both occasions, and the key to that cabinet was on her dressing table, where she had set it the night he gave it to her. She had not expected this. She had not permitted herself to expect it. She stood in the morning light of the churchyard and held her husband's hand and looked at the old stone and the new leaves, and Frederick said something to Julian that made Julian's mouth move in the way that was not quite a smile, but that she had come to understand was the nearest he generally came to one. And she thought of her father's shop and its long shelves and the smell of old paper. And she thought that her father would have liked the library at Thornwell. And she thought that she would write a letter to Mrs. Margaret Holt in Bath this evening, and she would attempt to describe what had happened, knowing she would fail to find the words for the particular quality of the east light, or the weight of the question delivered in 11 words, or the way a man's voice sounds when he says your name as though he has been waiting for permission. She would say that the library was a collection worth spending a year inside. She would not say that she had not expected the man who came to mock her to become the man who could not stop looking, but she would mean it. The lilac in the library was already opening when they returned to the hall, and Mrs. Locke had set tea and a plate of the small cakes she made only on important occasions, and the room smelled of old paper and spring and the particular warmth of a house that has found its order, and Julian held the door for her as she crossed the threshold, and she looked at him once, briefly, before she went in. He was already smiling. Not the almost smile, not the contained movement at the corner of his mouth. This was the full thing, rare and unhurried, and she tucked it away in the same place she had tucked the small kindnesses, the cup of tea set beside the gallery stair, the margin note in the gray journal, the 11 words of the question. She went in. The lilac was pale and extravagant in the east light, and the catalog was on the table, and the shelves were full, and the room was, as it had always been, the most honest place in Thornwell Hall. And it was now the most honest place she knew. If you felt something this morning, leave it in the comments below, and come back next time for another story told with the same care. Thank you for staying until the end.